At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Golden Musical Memories of Yesteryear Gimme Radio. I am your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And this is Rachel Slobodian.
On behalf of the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union, welcome, Gimme Radio listeners. In this segment, we'd like to discuss what we saw at the Revolution, what Rachel and I experienced at the 9/12 March on Washington, D.C. For those of you unfamiliar with this event, it was billed as the biggest gathering ever of not only fiscal conservatives, but also independents, moderates, plain old ordinary folks concerned with the tax and spend and borrow mentality coming out of Washington, D.C. It was designed to bring together people from across the country to gather in Freedom Plaza, march down Pennsylvania Avenue, and hold a rally at the U.S. Capitol, all directed toward more fiscally responsible government. And boy, was it ever a success. When this event was first being planned by our allies at FreedomWorks, there were many skeptics out there who said, well, people on our side of the spectrum who support limited or even reduced government, we're just not too good at putting together mass rallies like the other side of the spectrum is. After all, people who have a vested interest in bigger government often get time off from their unions to go participate. They may be students, and they have plenty of free time. They may just be recipients of government benefit checks who are often paid to go and attend these events. But we sure showed them on Saturday, September 12th, did we not, Rachel?
We did. And what's really important to remember is that all the folks that showed up on Saturday, unlike some of the organizations that happen on the left side, all of these people were coming paying their own way. There was no subsidy, no added incentive. It was because these people cared about the direction our government was going and wanted to stop it.
Yeah, indeed. All the contributions that the participating organizations made went solely to the logistics of the event. In other words, providing a sound system, making sure there were adequate sanitary facilities, making sure that all of the security costs were paid for, even the expenses of chartering buses, which is something that many groups will normally do. That was not the case with the 9/12 D.C. March. Bus after bus came from across the United States, and all of them were paid for by the people riding on them, not the organizations here in Washington, D.C., urging them to ride here in the first place. So let's paint a picture of what the scene looked like on Saturday morning, September 12th, at Freedom Plaza, which is right behind the National Press Club and Willard Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C., barely a stone's throw from the White House. When Rachel and I first arrived, what was it, around 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, there were already people gathering for an event that was supposed to start at 9 o'clock. We could see lots of signs and banners, plain ordinary folks who were already revved up about the march down Pennsylvania Avenue, but there were a lot of events to start off the festivities. If I recall, our president, Dwayne Pardee, was one of the first to address the crowd at Freedom Plaza. Did you get to hear him, Rachel?
I did, yes. He actually was one of the first speakers. Senator DeMint came out to sign some books, and Dwayne spoke on how we can, as you know, regular citizens can work to stop our government from wasting our tax dollars.
Very interesting. I remember arriving and I could just barely hear Dwayne's speech. And you have to remember, folks, Freedom Plaza is a large area, but not a cavernous one. It's only a few blocks long and 1 block wide. It should have been very easy to hear anyone speaking, but the crowd had already grown so large, I couldn't even get within 200 feet of the stage where people were speaking. at the beginning point of this event. I remember trying to find our colleague, Josh Culling, who had a bunch of literature to hand out to the crowd. And even though he and I were talking on cell phone and supposedly directly staring at each other because we were guiding each other by landmarks, I still couldn't see him in the crowd. It took me about 15 minutes to find him. It was an incredible thing that there were so many people there already that it was difficult for us to find our colleagues.
Yes, I know actually when Dwayne was speaking, the number of people that were surrounding him on that stage, they were so packed so closely together that I had to weave my way through because they were literally shoulder to shoulder already. It was that packed.
Incredible. And just being able to take photographs of Dwayne involved a lot of very tricky, almost acrobatics, you would call them. And it was great to see, though. Now, as the Freedom Plaza event went on, I seem to recall that so many people were streaming into it. We had easily hit more than 5,000 people even before 9 o'clock, the official start of the event. So it was determined that people like Dwayne should start speaking right away instead of at the scheduled time. So he actually went on around 8:30 or so, and the crowd just continued to swell way past 10,000 by 9 o'clock, the official start time. And of course, at that point, we had reached the critical mass whereby the Washington, D.C. police had said, look, it's unsafe to have these many people gathering in one place. You all are going to have to start your march down Pennsylvania Avenue a lot earlier. And a lot earlier we did, about an hour sooner than we had expected. And the crowds just kept coming and coming. I remember riding in on Washington, D.C.'s mass transit system called Metro Rail. And while I got on at a spot outside in suburban Maryland, I didn't see many fellow marchers. But as each stop progressed toward Washington, D.C., more and more people got on that train until it was almost totally packed. And again, folks, I was one of the volunteers who had to arrive early on site, and yet there were all these people with me determined to do the same thing. I later received reports that as of, say, 10 o'clock that morning, all the parking lots at the satellite stations for Metro in the near suburbs were just filled with cars, and that the platforms were packed as if it were a regular work day. And again, this was a Saturday, not a regular work day, so obviously the crowds were huge. One report had it that Metro had an excess of about 80,000 passengers above normal on Saturday. I can say most of that is attributable to the March on Washington when you consider all the buses that showed up, people who drove, people who walked. Obviously, the 80,000 figure is just the tip of the iceberg. So, as the march began to go down Pennsylvania Avenue, Rachel, where were you in all of this crowd?
Well, actually, I didn't stay in one position. I walked all around taking different pictures, trying to get to higher points, which was a little difficult given the layout. About the highest you get is a park bench in terms of taking an aerial shot. One thing that really struck me in terms of the number of people I saw was not just the massive amounts of people, but also the age range. I literally saw a mother with her 2-year-old daughter holding a sign that said, "I'm 2 and I'm already in debt." And then things like there were not only a lot of senior citizens coming out, but parents with families and teenagers and even people with really young children that came out because they all agreed that they are frustrated with the direction their government's going.
Yeah, the teenagers were the ones that struck me the most because obviously little children, well, they're very young and impressionable. One might say, well, their parents brought them here, but they may not really know what's going on. Not so for all these teenagers, 12, 14, 16-year-olds who are already very upset about the debt burden they have to bear. Some of them had calculated it down to the last dollar, and they were talking about, my gosh, I'm already in debt $30,000, $40,000, and based on what the government's doing, it could be more than $100,000 before I even get in the workforce. So of course these people were mad, and that is an encouraging sign for our movement, one that is often characterized as one of just grumpy old people. No, there was a mixture indeed in the crowd, as you say. And I remember as the march started down Pennsylvania Avenue, the flow of crowd was just incredible. It was as if a hole had opened up in the ground and endless numbers of people were streaming out of it. You kept thinking, well, Freedom Plaza can't possibly hold all these people. Where are they coming from? The answer was they were coming from everywhere, down all the side streets, out of metro stations, everywhere. And according to official statistics, and by official I mean people who sponsored this march and who were monitoring the crowd flow, because the Park Service doesn't do crowd estimates, Pennsylvania Avenue, which is 4 lanes, even 6 lanes at some points, was jammed with people walking down it for the better part of 3 hours. Now, start doing a little bit of spatial math, folks. The march route was 10 blocks long, and 4 to 6 lanes of street were being taken up, not to mention some sidewalk, by people for the better part of 3 hours. We contend that the figure of tens of thousands of participants in the march that was given initially is way, way off. In fact, the initial estimate of 75,000 for the capacity of the crowd was taken at 10 a.m. on the Mall in Washington, D.C., not at the staging point at Freedom Plaza. That really didn't account for anyone who was marching to the rally. It was just counting people who were already on the Mall, who decided, well, I've gotten to Washington, D.C., I might as well put myself here. And if you take a look at previous estimates of crowds by things like the Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C., the Million Man March, USA Today's estimate of how big a crowd would be for the inauguration of President Obama, you have to think we had at least 250,000 people there. Just the part between 3rd Street and the grounds of the Capitol was, by USA Today's estimate, capable of holding about 240,000 people. We packed that entire area and still had overflow crowds on the sides of the Capitol and across from 3rd Street. So again, clearly, 250,000 is not only a plausible number, it's probably a minimum number. That ought to speak volumes, folks. That even would outdo most of the pro-life marches that have been staged in Washington, D.C. So, what else did you see, Rachel, that might have made an impression on you? Not just the size of the crowd and maybe the speeches that were given, including the one by our own Andrew Moylan. What about the personalities of the people that you saw and met? Did they seem sincere to you?
Most certainly. And you know what was really surprising was the number of people who had said, I've never done anything like this before in my life. I know personally, I certainly had never done anything like that. And I think it's for the reason that you cited earlier about people often think that conservative types don't really care to be the sort of crazy activists. But I guess the point is that by participating in this march, by no means were you labeled a crazy activist, but there were legitimate people coming with legitimate concerns about how our country is being run. And
yeah, I can't count the number of times when I was speaking to folks who were participating in the march, them telling me, this is the first time I've ever done anything like this. These were not, for example, Republican Party hacks, as they've been portrayed in the media. These were not grass tops people, just your typical letter-writing activists who always seem to show up to these things. These were first-time citizen activists, an absolutely vital component of any movement that hopes to enact change in the future. I was truly amazed by that. Many people that I didn't know, obviously, personally, but that I would never have recognized as being activists. You know, when you've been in Washington for a while, you can kind of tell the person who would participate in political campaigns or political movements or nonprofit organizations. These folks were unlike that. They were sign carriers. They were people who spent out of their own pocket and with their own time and using their own energy a whole lot to come here and be a part of the 9/12 March on D.C. So many people are saying that there is indeed a future for the 9/12 D.C. movement. Some are already saying, hey, maybe we should have a rally on April 15th of 2010. That would be a very appropriate date, given that that will be the income tax filing deadline. Maybe that's a possibility. And these calls were not coming from organizers of the rally, like Freedom Works and National Taxpayers Union, but participants in the rally. And that's a very good sign, because even if we do not hold another event here in Washington, D.C., there appears to be a fervor that will not subside, a reawakening or rebirth of the American spirit that will live long after 9/12. And that's the best takeaway I think we can have from this fantastic event. And now we move on to your very favorite segment, the Outrage of the Week. And this is a big outrage. This week, a congressional oversight panel had some pretty grim news for taxpayers who have become unwilling investors in General Motors and Chrysler. You may recall, Gimme Radio listeners, that in late 2008, it was proposed that taxpayers give tens of billions of dollars to back up the two giant failing automakers, GM and Chrysler, through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. There were also proposals to grant an additional amount of money outside of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Those came before the House of Representatives and were defeated, and no more attempts were made in 2008 to try to legislate a bailout. But ever eager to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, the Bush administration decided, well, we're going to cut a deal anyway. We're going to siphon funds from that Troubled Asset Relief Program. We're going to take a gamble that the Treasury Secretary has the authority to use that money, not just for financial institutions, but for automakers as well. And so they engineered a bailout by administrative fiat. Truly one of the grimmest among a number of grim moments for that administration. And what has the Barack Obama White House done to ameliorate this situation? Nothing. In fact, it has worsened the situation by creating more of what people call moral hazard, the ability to free yourself of any concerns about accountability or profit when you're gambling with someone else's money. And that's exactly what's been happening with GM and Chrysler. This latest report is a pretty grim one, Rachel. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about it?
Well, the Congressional Oversight Panel, which just is what you were talking about, came out last week, said that there would be a projected loss of $23 billion. And what that basically means is that the companies, General Motors and Chrysler, will not be able to pay back at least $23 billion that were given in taxpayer dollars, which basically means taking $23 billion and flushing it down the toilet, because as we've seen, that money hasn't drastically improved car sales.
And speaking again of moral hazard may be the concept that is indeed in play here when you consider that General Motors recently unveiled a campaign providing a 60-day money-back guarantee to customers who buy GM automobiles and are dissatisfied with them. Well, that kind of prompts the question, would a company that didn't have taxpayer backing, that was accountable to real private shareholders instead of captive shareholders, which taxpayers are, would they do such a thing? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is for certain, this is a gamble that's being taken not with private funds, but with public funds. And that's what makes it such a reprehensible thing. If they want to enact a marketing strategy promising a 120-day guarantee, great for them, might be a bold move. but they've rigged the market in the first place with tax dollars, and that's what's wrong with this whole thing. Not only the money-back guarantee, but the fact that GM and Chrysler received such a huge infusion of taxpayer cash in the first place. And in fact, that $23 billion may very well be the tip of the iceberg. If I recall, Rachel, there were some pretty ominous projections the panel made that if we ever wanted to recover what's left of that $50-odd billion, what would happen to the share prices of GM?
In terms of what would happen to the share prices, they actually said that it would be highly optimistic to expect them to reach what was beyond their highest share price. So the highest GM ever was $57.2 billion, and they're expected, in order to pay back in full, they're expected to have a share price reaching $67.6 billion. And that number is pretty unrealistic considering that it's never ever gotten higher than $57.2 billion.
Incredible. So the value of GM as a company would have to surpass by upwards of $10 billion anything it had ever reached before. Now, the likelihood of that happening even in the next 5 years is probably next to zero, which means that this was a total loss to taxpayers. Well, if not was, will likely be a total loss to taxpayers, just as so many advocates like NTU had predicted when they opposed this bailout in the first place. There were even Republican lawmakers, self-professed fiscal conservatives, thumping their chests saying, this is just a loan to GM. They'll be able to pay it back. How dare you taxpayer organizations count this as a giant subsidy or a loss? Well, who's laughing now? Self-proclaimed fiscally conservative Republicans. Well, nobody's laughing now. We're all crying now. And that was something we warned about months and months ago. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office released a report earlier from this panel. I believe it was in June at some point, where the Congressional Budget Office said pretty much the same thing. They gave different figures, but the outlook was equally gloomy. Isn't that right, Rachel?
That's right. It's actually even more gloomy, I would say, because out of the first $55 billion that was given, we would lose $40 billion of it. So that means that only $15 billion would actually be used in a way for the company to rebound. $40 billion of it would be lost, which is even bigger than that number we were seeing from GM.
Unreal. First, this Cash for Clunkers program, which cost $3 billion. Now this bailout, which appears to be a totally losing proposition for taxpayers, or if not totally, darn near totally. Boy, what a horrible experiment in corporate welfare. And now we are still stuck with majority ownership in the GM company. And I say stuck again because taxpayers never voted to become shareholders of GM like normal investors do. You can't vote with your money when your money is tax dollars. You can't tell the IRS, well, I don't feel like bailing out GM, so I'm going to send you a smaller check this year. I'm going to act like an investor. Well, try telling that to the IRS. You'll be doing a term in jail, or at least you'll be financially ruined as their lawyers come after you. So this has all been a hoax, this notion that they've been given a loan and that the government wants to get out of owning GM as soon as possible, and that as soon as GM is on its feet and is a productive and thriving company, this whole experiment in socialism will be over. No, we're either in this for the long haul, hoping that we can recover a pittance of what taxpayers sunk into it, or we're just going to have to accept a total loss. Either way, taxpayers have gotten the shaft. And that is the outrage of the week. Well, no edition of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio would be complete without our Legislation of the Week segment. And this week, we're talking about legislation that taxpayers ought to hate, not like. And this is the Senate alternative to the House Democrats' healthcare reform plan. Unfortunately, despite some promise that Senator Max Baucus, who is chair of the Finance Committee in the upper chamber, would come up with a plan that is far less offensive to taxpayers than the House's health care plan. He has instead come up with legislation that's only modestly better, or I guess we should say not as bad as taxpayers would expect. By that I mean we're talking about a cost of less than $1 trillion over 10 years for the healthcare reform plan, as opposed to more than $1 trillion for the House's version of healthcare reform. Some improvement. We're also talking about perhaps a broader base tax on Americans under the Senate plan than the House's plan. We don't believe any segment of American society should be singled out for harsh tax treatment, but it appears pretty clear that more citizens would be touched by the taxes in the Senate's plan, at least directly and immediately, than in the House's plan. Of course, all taxpayers will suffer under either plan, owing to the fact that they would reduce economic growth, penalize business expansion, and all those awful things. But the Senate's plan has a bunch of interesting tax wrinkles, including one that would impose a very large excise tax on insurance benefits that are worth, well, somewhat more than the average that many Americans might already have. In other words, the tax would be imposed when the benefits offered to an individual or family exceed a certain level, several $1,000s. Well, that has already prompted Senate Democrats, among them Senator Jay Rockefeller of West Virginia, to say, this is probably a big middle-class tax. Why does he say that? Because many of the mine workers in his state of West Virginia have insurance policies that would probably face this excise tax. And I believe that's a rate of 35%, Rachel?
Yes, that's correct, 35%. And, oftentimes the Democrat senators or just anyone in general who's trying to justify a tax increase says, oh, don't worry, it'll be placed upon the insurance company. But the obvious question is, well, how is the insurance company going to get the money? And that's by trickling down to the person who's being insured by the insurance company. And so it's disingenuous for them to claim that citizens won't feel this tax increase because the consumer will be the person to pay the extra cost.
Yes, Rachel brings up a very important point here, folks. Businesses don't pay taxes. The rest of us do. That's not because they're evading the taxes. It's a simple fact that an additional tax on any business is simply an increase in the cost of doing business. And that means the firm has some decisions to make. Number one, the firm can pass the costs along directly to the consumer in the form of higher prices for the goods and services they sell. Number two, they can try to absorb the tax, meaning they have to cut overhead elsewhere. That overhead could include employee benefits, employee salaries, or hiring new employees. So again, the tax could force the firm to lay off existing workers or just forego hiring additional ones. The third way that companies can deal with higher taxes, to disappoint their shareholders, to say, well, sorry, this is coming right out of our bottom line. The federal government is taking away part of our profit margin, so don't expect a huge dividend on your stocks this year. Why is that an important thing? Because over 55 million households in America are invested one way or another in the stock market, through mutual funds, through dividend reinvestment plans, through straight shares of stock. All of these things can be very, very hurtful to citizens who might have insurance company stocks in their portfolios. And you may want to check that, folks. You might be very surprised to see that you actually do own such stocks, and they would take a serious hit under the Baucus plan. So, when you hear of the Senate's alternative to the House's health care bill, you ought to realize this is an alternative that doesn't do a whole lot more for taxpayers than what President Obama and the House of Representatives have already tried to inflict upon us. We still have to look for a health care plan that emphasizes personal choice, freedom, low taxes, and less spending. And hopefully, as we've discussed in the past, the plans of Senator Jim DeMint Republican of South Carolina, and others will carry the day. So in closing, folks, remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm Pete